The war had ended, but at what cost? Robert Baratheon, the man who led the rebellion against the Mad King, lay lifeless on the battlefield, his body torn apart in the final clash against the Targaryen loyalists. The rebellion had been won, but the question remained, who would sit the Iron Throne? Jon Arryn, the noble mentor to both Robert and Ned Stark, had gathered the remaining lords to discuss the future of Westeros. Stannis Baratheon, Robert's younger brother, had a claim to the throne, but his cold and rigid nature made him an unpopular choice. Renly Baratheon was young, charming, but untested. The realm needed a king who commanded respect and had the loyalty of the North, the Riverlands, and the Vale, Ned Stark. At first he refused. "I am no king," Ned said, his voice heavy with grief and exhaustion. "I swore to defend the North, not rule the Seven Kingdoms." But the lords insisted. The war had ravaged Westeros, and they needed a ruler who could rebuild and bring stability. Tywin Lannister, always calculating, saw an opportunity. "The realm needs a strong and just king," he said, "one who can unite us." Ned saw the trap. If he refused, the Lannisters might claim the throne, and chaos would reign. If he accepted, he would be thrust into a world of deceit and betrayal, a world he despised. But he could not abandon the people to war. For his children, for the North, and for the sake of peace, he agreed. And so, Eddard Stark was crowned King of Westeros. The Northmen cheered, their voices carrying through the halls of the Red Keep. But Ned Stark felt only the weight of the crown upon his head. He had not wanted this. He had wanted to return to Winterfell, to his family, to the cold and quiet honor of the North. Instead, he stood before the gathered lords and ladies of Westeros, a reluctant king in a kingdom built on blood and betrayal. His first act as king was to solidify alliances. Tywin Lannister, always a man of strategy, had already begun maneuvering for power. He offered his daughter Cersei as queen. Ned refused. He would not bind himself to the Lannisters. Instead, he chose to rule alone, with his wife Catelyn at his side. This insult did not sit well with Tywin. Stannis Baratheon, ever bitter, demanded recognition as Robert's heir. The throne should pass by law, he argued, not by choice. Ned, knowing Stannis to be a just but severe man, granted him Dragonstone and the royal fleet, hoping to placate him. Renly, always the politician, was made master of laws. Jon Arryn remained hand of the king. The North, the Vale, and the Riverlands stood firmly behind Ned, but the South was uncertain, and the Lannisters were quiet, too quiet. Then came the whispers of Viserys Targaryen and his sister Daenerys, exiled across the narrow sea. "They are only children," Ned said, refusing to send assassins as others had suggested. "I will not be a butcher, but mercy is a dangerous thing in the Game of Thrones." As the realm settled into an uneasy peace, shadows moved behind the scenes. Tywin Lannister, insulted and spurned, began plotting. Littlefinger, ever ambitious, whispered into the ears of the court, and across the sea a dragon began to stir. Winter was coming, but it was not just the cold that Ned Stark had to fear. Months passed, and King Eddard Stark ruled with a steady but cautious hand. He spent his time rebuilding the realm, cutting excess spending that Robert had indulged in, and ensuring the safety of the small folk. The lords of Westeros found his rule just, if not a little too rigid. Where Robert had been careless, Ned was strict. Where Robert had sought pleasure, Ned sought duty. But the Game of Thrones was not won with honor alone. Tywin Lannister had withdrawn to Casterly Rock, his golden lions watching and waiting. Without a marriage alliance between the Starks and the Lannisters, tension simmered. Jaime Lannister, still in the Kingsguard, served begrudgingly under the new king, his pride wounded by his father's whispered fury. Cersei, now denied her place as queen, seethed in resentment. In secret, she met with Littlefinger. "The Northman does not belong here," she hissed, her green eyes filled with venom. "He wears a crown, but he does not play the game." Littlefinger, ever the opportunist, smirked. "That is why he will fall." The first strike came not from the Lannisters, but from the shadows of Essos. Across the narrow sea, Viserys Targaryen had arranged a marriage between his sister, Daenerys, and Khal Drogo of the Dothraki. Word soon reached King's Landing. Viserys was rallying support to reclaim the throne. The small council debated fiercely. "They must be dealt with," Stannis declared, "before they become a true threat." "We cannot afford a war across the sea," Jon Arryn warned. "We have enemies enough at home." Ned sat in silence, considering the weight of his choice. He had refused to assassinate the children before, but now they were no longer children. Daenerys was wed to a warlord, and Viserys was calling himself the rightful king. Could he afford mercy now? Before he could decide, a greater threat arose: rebellion in the Westerlands. Tywin Lannister had finally made his move. The banners of Casterly Rock were raised in defiance, and Jaime Lannister, under his father's command, declared war against the crown. The realm was at war once more, and King Eddard Stark would soon learn that ruling with honor was far different from ruling with power. The banners of war were raised, and King Eddard Stark found himself exactly where he never wanted to be, fighting another rebellion. The Lannisters had made their move, declaring the Westerlands independent from the crown. Tywin Lannister, ever the strategist, had gathered his bannermen, securing the loyalty of the Rock and its vassals. Jaime Lannister had left King's Landing in the dead of night, returning to Casterly Rock to lead his father's armies. The realm was once again on the brink of war. Ned wasted no time. He summoned his allies, the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands. Robb Stark, barely a man grown, rode south from Winterfell with his bannermen, leading the might of the North. Jon Arryn commanded the Vale's knights, and the Riverlands, ruled by Hoster Tully, sent their forces as well. The stage was set for a battle that would determine the fate of the realm. But war was not only fought with swords. Cersei Lannister remained in King's Landing, her mind sharp with vengeance. She had been denied her place as queen, humiliated in court, and now her father had taken up arms. She would not sit idly by. Through whispers and bribes, she turned to the city's underbelly, working with Littlefinger to sow discord. The Gold Cloaks, who once served the crown, now wavered in their loyalty. Ned sensed the danger, but his focus was on the battlefield. The first battle took place in the Riverlands, where Jaime Lannister led the charge against the Tully forces. The Kingslayer was no fool. He struck fast and hard, knowing that if he could break the River Lords, he could march straight to King's Landing. But Robb Stark, young but brilliant, maneuvered his forces well, leading an ambush that drove Jaime's army into retreat. Victory, but at a cost. The war had only just begun. Meanwhile, across the sea, another storm was brewing. Daenerys Targaryen, now Khaleesi of the Dothraki, had begun hearing whispers of Westeros. Viserys still raved about his rightful throne. But the Dothraki did not respect weakness. They followed strength, and Daenerys was proving to be far stronger than her brother. As the war raged in Westeros, she began to dream of conquest. Back in King's Landing, treachery struck. A riot broke out in the streets, seemingly random but orchestrated in the shadows. The Gold Cloaks, meant to keep order, hesitated, and in the chaos an assassin struck, aiming for King Eddard Stark himself. The blade missed his heart but cut deep into his side. Blood spilled onto the stone floors of the Red Keep. The king staggered, his vision blurring, and for the first time he realized honor would not be enough to win this war. The pain was sharp, searing through his ribs as blood soaked his tunic. Ned Stark had survived the assassin's blade, but the wound was deep and the meaning behind the attack was clear. His enemies were growing bolder. As he lay recovering in his chambers, Catelyn Stark at his side, the small council convened in a storm of accusations and fear. "This was no mere street thief," Stannis Baratheon declared. "Someone ordered this. Someone who wants you dead." Varys, ever the whisperer, nodded. "The assassin was found, but he slit his own throat before we could question him. A professional." Littlefinger smirked. "So many enemies, Your Grace. The Lannisters, the Targaryens, or perhaps even someone within these very halls." Ned shot him a glare, but his mind was racing. The Lannisters had declared war openly. Why send an assassin in secret? This was something else. Someone working in the shadows. Someone who wanted to weaken him before the real war began. But there was no time to dwell on it. A raven arrived from the front lines. Robb Stark had won another battle, capturing a Lannister stronghold in the Riverlands. But Jaime Lannister had regrouped, and the Westerlands were preparing for a massive counterattack. Even as he recovered, Ned had no choice. He ordered more troops south, bolstering Robb's forces, while Jon Arryn led the Vale's knights toward the conflict. Stannis, ever the loyal soldier, readied the royal fleet to blockade the Westerlands, ensuring that the Lannisters could not receive supplies by sea. Yet as war raged, another threat loomed across the narrow sea. Daenerys Targaryen had begun gathering her strength. Khal Drogo, once uninterested in Westeros, had now set his sights on conquest. At first he had laughed at the idea of crossing the sea, but Daenerys, with her growing power and the loyalty of her Dothraki warriors, had convinced him otherwise. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was Khaleesi, and she was coming for her birthright. Ned knew of the growing threat but refused to act against Daenerys yet. "I will not be the butcher Robert was," he insisted. "We will fight the war in front of us before we worry about shadows across the sea." But shadows do not wait. Little did Ned know, the real war was not just on the battlefield. It was in the heart of King's Landing, and the next betrayal was coming from someone far closer than he realized. As Ned Stark recovered from his wound, King's Landing grew restless. The war in the Riverlands raged on, and whispers filled the air like a gathering storm. Littlefinger, always lurking in the shadows, continued spinning his web, and Cersei Lannister had not been idle. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky, a messenger arrived at the Red Keep. The news sent a chill through the court. Jaime Lannister had struck back. Robb Stark had won battles, but the young wolf had underestimated the ruthlessness of the Lannisters. Jaime had led a lightning-fast assault, smashing through a section of the Riverland forces and capturing Edmure Tully. With the River Lords shaken, Tywin Lannister now marched eastward with an army of 20,000. Ned could not afford to remain in King's Landing any longer. His wound had not fully healed, but there was no choice. He would ride north with the royal army and take command personally. But Cersei Lannister had different plans. That night, as Ned prepared for war, he received an unexpected visitor. Varys. The spider moved like a ghost, his voice a whisper of warning. "You must not leave the city, Your Grace." Ned frowned. "The war must be won. My son needs me." Varys bowed his head. "The war outside the walls is not the only war you must fear." It was then that Ned realized the trap had already been set. The assassin's blade had failed. Now the next move would come not from the battlefield, but from within the very walls of the Red Keep. He barely had time to react. The doors burst open. Armed gold cloaks poured into the chamber, their swords drawn. At their head stood Janos Slynt, commander of the City Watch, and beside him, Petyr Baelish, smiling like a man who had just won everything. "I warned you not to trust me," Littlefinger said. Betrayal. Janos Slynt stepped forward. "By order of the Queen Regent, you are under arrest, Your Grace." Ned's fingers curled around the hilt of ice, but he was outnumbered. Catelyn was miles away, his children vulnerable. To fight was to die, and if he died now, the Lannisters would claim everything. So for the first time in his life, King Eddard Stark surrendered. They dragged him to the black cells beneath the Red Keep, his crown stripped from his head. Cersei Lannister sat on the Iron Throne, her emerald eyes gleaming with triumph. "The North will never stand for this," Ned growled. Cersei only smiled. "Then let them come." She had played the game better than he had, and now all of Westeros would pay the price. The damp air of the black cells reeked of rot and despair, but Eddard Stark felt nothing but cold fury. He had been foolish, too slow to see the dagger in the dark, too rigid in his belief that honor could triumph over treachery. Now he sat shackled in the darkness beneath the very throne he had sworn to protect. Time passed in a haze of aching bones and whispered rumors. Varys visited him only once, slipping through the shadows like a specter. "You should have taken my warning more seriously, Your Grace," the spider murmured. "Now the realm teeters on the brink of chaos." Ned glared. "Cersei does not have the right to rule." Varys tilted his head. "Perhaps not, but power, as I have always said, is where men believe it resides. And right now, the realm believes it resides with her." Ned clenched his fists. "What of my children?" Varys hesitated. "Your daughters remain in the Red Keep. Sansa is under Cersei's watchful eye, and Arya, he let out a small breath. She has vanished into the city. Perhaps that is for the best. And Robb? The young wolf marches south with fury in his heart, Varys said. The North will not stand for this insult. War is inevitable. Ned had no doubt. The moment word of his imprisonment reached Winterfell, Robb would rally his banners. The North did not forget. The Riverlands would rise in defiance, and the Vale, loyal to Jon Arryn's memory, would not stand idle. But war alone would not save him. Somewhere beyond the walls of the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister was tightening her grip on the throne. She had installed her puppet, Janos Slynt, as commander of the City Watch. The Lannisters controlled the gold cloaks, the treasury, and the court. And Littlefinger, damn him, was richer and more powerful than ever. But one thing gave Ned hope. His crown had been stolen, but he was still the true king. The realm had named him. The people, the North, the Riverlands, they would fight for him, if he could only survive long enough to see it. The news reached Winterfell on a bitter wind. King Eddard Stark had been betrayed. He was a prisoner in the dungeons of King's Landing. Robb Stark, barely past 17, stood before the great lords of the North with ice in his veins. His father had raised him to be just, to be honorable, but the time for honor had passed. The Lannisters have declared war on the North, he said, his voice steady. They have taken my father. They hold my sisters captive. I will not stand for it. The great John Umber slammed a fist on the table. Then we ride south. We burn the Westerlands and take your father back in chains if we have to. Rose Bolton, ever the calculating man, leaned forward. The Riverlands are already fighting. We must reach them before the Lannisters can crush them. The banners were called. The North rose in a storm of steel and fury. Robb Stark, the young wolf, would lead them. And for the first time in generations, the North was marching to war, not for vengeance, not for rebellion, but for their king. Cersei Lannister sat upon the Iron Throne, her lips curled in satisfaction. She had won. Eddard Stark was a traitor in chains. His northern armies would come, but they would break against the might of the Crown Lands and the Lannister forces. Still, a single problem remained. As long as Eddard Stark lived, he was a threat. The court demanded justice. The lords whispered of execution. Joffrey, young and cruel, sneered. Kill him! Let his head rot on the walls. But Cersei, ever the politician, shook her head. Not yet. No, there was still a use for Eddard Stark. She would offer him a choice, swear fealty to the Lannisters, declare Joffrey the true king, and command the North to stand down, or die. The dungeon doors groaned open, and Ned Stark looked up from his place in the darkness. His body was weak, his wounds unhealed, but his mind remained sharp. He knew this moment would come. Cersei Lannister entered, draped in crimson silk, her golden hair shining in the torchlight. Behind her stood 2 Lannister guards and, as always, Peter Baelish, his smirk thin and knowing. You should have accepted my help, Ned, Littlefinger murmured. Ned ignored him, his eyes fixed on the Queen Regent. You've come to gloat? Cersei tilted her head, her expression unreadable. No, my dear Lord Stark. I've come to offer you life. Ned laughed bitterly. Spare me your false mercy, Cersei. She stepped closer, her voice lowering. This war will destroy everything, Ned. The North marches. My father's armies are ready to crush them. Your son, your proud, foolish boy, is walking into a war he cannot win. Ned's jaw tightened. The North does not kneel. She sighed as if disappointed. It will, or it will burn. Then her tone shifted, smooth and seductive. Swear fealty to Joffrey, bend the knee, acknowledge him as king, and command the North to stand down. If you do this, I will let you live. I will release your daughters. You will be sent to the wall, where you can live out your days in peace. Ned narrowed his eyes. And if I refuse? Her expression hardened. Then I put your head on a spike and send Sansa to join it. A cold fury gripped Ned's chest. He knew Cersei was ruthless. But this was pure cruelty. His daughters were hostages. His son rode to war, and he sat helpless in chains. There was no honor left in this game, but there was survival. The crowd was restless. Whispers rippled through the streets of King's Landing. The great king of the North, the man who had defied the Lannisters, was to speak. Ned was led to the steps of the Sept of Baelor, his body frail but his spirit unbroken. He saw Sansa in the crowd, her blue eyes red from tears and his heart clenched. Joffrey sat on the Iron Throne, watching with a twisted smile. Cersei stood beside him, calm and composed, while the court looked on with eager anticipation. Ned took a breath. He had made his choice. "I, Eddard Stark," he began, his voice hoarse but steady, "acknowledge Joffrey Baratheon as the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms." A murmur spread through the crowd. Cersei let out a silent breath of relief. It was done. But Joffrey leaned forward, his boyish grin laced with malice. "Good. Now bring me his head." The world froze. Cersei turned sharply, eyes widening. "Joffrey, no!" "I am the king!" Joffrey snapped, waving his hand. "Kill him!" The executioner stepped forward. The last thing Ned Stark saw was the blue sky above. And then the sword fell. The news of Ned Stark's execution spread like wildfire. The streets of King's Landing erupted in unrest. But in the north, the reaction was something far more dangerous. Robb Stark, upon hearing of his father's death, did not weep. He did not rage. He called his bannermen, and the lords of the north, the Riverlands, and the Vale all came together under a single cry. The king in the north. The war would not stop. It would burn hotter than ever, and the Lannisters would soon learn the price of betraying a Stark. Daenerys Targaryen stood atop a dune, the hot winds of the Red Waste whipping around her. In her arms, her dragons stirred, their scales shimmering in the sun. The old kings of Westeros were dying. The realm was in chaos, and soon the Dragon Queen would return to claim her birthright.